At 02:16 on the morning of May 6th in the year 1944, Lieutenant Commander Brent Able stood on the bridge of the destroyer escort Buckley as moonlight spread across the Atlantic in a pale glowing sheet that made every ripple shine like silver and made the air feel sharp and awake and full of tension because the night carried the weight of something approaching. Moments earlier, an Avenger patrol pilot had radioed in frantic coordinates, telling Able that a German submarine had surfaced about 20 miles ahead to the west of the Cape Verde Islands. That submarine was U-66, the seventh most successful U-boat Germany had ever sent into the Atlantic, and it had been roaming the ocean for nearly 4 months since mid-January without resupply, and the men aboard were exhausted and thirsty for fuel and desperate for help, yet still fully capable of killing. U-66 had already sent 33 Allied ships to the bottom, and had destroyed more than 200,000 tons of shipping, and its commander was known for taking bold risks in the hunt for victims. Able was 34 years old, and had been in command of Buckley for 11 months, and even with his experience he had never faced a submarine this close on the surface under such perfect night conditions that favored a fast approach. He ordered flank speed, and the Buckley surged forward at 23½ knots, cutting through calm water that looked almost too peaceful for a battlefield. The aircraft above them kept circling, feeding new course directions as it watched U-66 creep across the sea to recharge its drained batteries. At 0308, 3 bright red flares burst upward from the submarine. They were recognition signals and confirmation that the Germans believed Buckley was the supply submarine they had been waiting for. Able kept silent and held fire and let his ship close the distance like a predator, sliding through tall grass. 4,000 yards shrank to 3,000, then 2,000, and still the submarine had not reacted. But then the German lookouts finally understood the truth. The enemy was not their friend. A torpedo splashed into the water and streaked toward Buckley. Able ordered a hard turn to port, and the torpedo shot past the starboard side, missing by only a handful of yards. At 03:20, Able fired the first American shots of the battle. The 3-inch guns boomed and the opening salvo smashed into U-66, just forward of the conning tower, knocking the submarine's deck gun out of action. The 20mm guns opened up. The 40mm guns spat fire. Tracers streaked through the darkness and slammed into the burning silhouette of the submarine. The Germans fought back with machine guns, but their bullets flashed high above the American decks as Buckley held her course and poured relentless fire into the enemy hull. At 03:24, U-66 launched a second torpedo from her stern tubes. Able saw the wake slicing toward them and ordered another violent turn, this time to starboard. The torpedo hissed across their bow and missed by a terrifying margin. Now the two vessels were racing almost side by side, barely 20 yards apart, close enough for Able to see German silhouettes struggling in the firelight atop the conning tower. Buckley unleashed everything she had, and for 16 roaring minutes, her guns hammered the submarine with 105 rounds from the 3-inch guns, along with thousands of smaller caliber shells that chewed through metal and flesh and left U-66 staggering in flames. Then at 03:29, after realizing that gunfire alone would not finish the fight, Able made a decision no destroyer escort commander had taken in modern war. He ordered a hard turn and rammed the submarine. The bow of Buckley lifted up onto the foredeck of U-66 and pinned the submarine beneath her in a grinding shriek of twisted steel. Then something no American sailor expected occurred. German crewmen swarmed from the burning conning tower. Some carried pistols, some clutched knives. They leapt onto Buckley's forecastle in a desperate attempt to board and overwhelm the Americans. The fight exploded instantly. Buckley's sailors grabbed whatever weapons they could reach. Thompson guns, pistols, rifles. But when ammunition ran dry, fists flew, and crewmen swung 3-inch shell casings and used coffee mugs snatched from the galley as improvised weapons. One German sailor even made it inside the ship and reached the wardroom where a steward's mate fought him off using a coffee pot. The brawl lasted only 2 minutes, but those 2 minutes were the first hand-to-hand combat on a United States Navy warship in more than 100 years. Klaus Herbig, the first officer of U-66, led the boarding attempt, trying to create enough chaos to let his captain break the submarine free. But the Americans fought too fiercely, and Herbig finally cried for surrender. Able threw engines to reverse, and Buckley backed away, leaving 5 armed Germans aboard, who were quickly subdued. But U-66 was not finished. The submarine regained motion, circled under power, and rammed Buckley on the starboard side at 0335, tearing open the engine room, twisting the stern, and shearing off the starboard propeller shaft. As the submarine passed, an American sailor tossed a hand grenade into the open conning tower, and fire erupted from below. U-66 continued forward, still moving at about 15 knots, still burning, still out of control, with both hatches open and German sailors leaping into the sea. At 0341, U-66 slipped beneath the Atlantic waves, still ablaze and still running under diesel power, ending one of the strangest battles of the entire war. U-66 slipped beneath the surface with fire bursting from her open hatches and her captain still aboard, and the sea swallowed her in only 16 minutes from the first shot to the moment she vanished. The crew of Buckley stood stunned on their damaged decks, realizing they had just fought the only hand-to-hand battle on a United States Navy ship in the entire span of the Second World War, and now 36 German survivors floated in the dark water around them. Some drifted silently, some called out in pain, some stared vacantly in shock. Yet Abel's ship was barely afloat. The starboard propeller shaft was torn away. A gaping wound opened the engine room to the Atlantic. At 0345, the chief engineer reported grim findings. Flooding was pouring into the starboard side. The shaft had been sheared clean off. Electrical lines had shorted. The engine room was a mess of twisted metal and sloshing seawater. Only the port engine remained functional, and they were more than 500 miles from the nearest safe harbor. But Abel did not hesitate. He ordered his men to begin rescue operations at once. Naval tradition required that sailors help their enemies after the fight, and Buckley's crew followed that code without question. The same men who had swung rifles, knives, fists, and coffee mugs against German boarders only minutes earlier now hauled those exhausted survivors aboard one by one. Some Germans cried, some were barely conscious, some carried burns across their arms and faces from the flames inside U-66. Others bore bullet wounds from the frantic fighting on the deck. Several trembled from exposure after plunging into the cold water and drifting helplessly as the submarine sank. The Americans moved quickly, offering blankets, morphine, and canteens of water. Within an hour, the 36 survivors had been gathered and transferred to the escort carrier Block Island, whose aircraft had found and tracked U-66 in the first place. 24 other German sailors went down with their submarine, including Oberleutnant Sir C. Richard Zeisch Orchen, the commander of U-66, who had remained at his post until the final moment. The loss of U-66 sent shockwaves through the German Navy because she had been one of their most successful hunters. Across 9 war patrols, she had destroyed 33 merchant ships, totaling more than 200,000 tons. She had also claimed 8 American vessels. Early in 1942, she torpedoed the Canadian passenger liner Lady Hawkins, killing 246 people, many of them civilians. She had joined the opening attacks of Operation Drumbeat, which tore apart American coastal shipping in the first months after the United States entered the war. Yet now she had been brought down not by depth charges or aircraft bombs or torpedoes, but by a destroyer escort weighing only 1,400 tons that had rammed her and fought her attackers with raw fists and broken mugs. Even as the crew on Buckley understood what they had done, their situation remained dangerous. The sun rose over the Atlantic on May 6th, and the damage became painfully clear. Hull plates along the starboard side were twisted like torn cloth. Water seeped relentlessly into compartments aft. The broken propeller shaft was not merely cracked, but completely gone. Every turn of the remaining engine put new strain on a ship designed for 2 balanced screws. Able ordered the ship to make for New York. It was more than 2,000 miles away. The Azores were closer but lacked the major repair facilities needed to rebuild the engine room. Boston could handle such extensive damage, but was even farther away than New York. Able knew the risks, but he trusted the port engine and believed his crew could nurse Buckley across the waves if the weather held. Task Group 2111 reformed around the wounded destroyer escort. Block Island circled overhead, providing constant aircraft patrols. 2 other escorts took screening positions on either flank. The message was clear. They would protect Buckley all the way home if they could. German radio operators across the Atlantic had heard U-66's final transmissions. They knew a battle had occurred. Other U-boats might now hunt the damaged American ship, hoping to finish what U-66 had begun. That fear echoed through the crew even as damage control teams worked non-stop through the morning to shore up the flooding bulk. Heads place wooden beams against weakened frames, weld temporary plates over the worst of the holes, and pump seawater out of the wounded stern. The engine room crew monitored the port engine so closely it seemed no one blinked for hours. If it failed, the ship would become dead weight drifting in wartime waters. Yet through luck, skill, and sheer determination, Buckley kept moving. By midday, the destroyer escort managed a steady 13 knots, though everyone aboard knew this speed could not last. Every shudder of the hull reminded them how close they had come to sinking. Every vibration warned them that the ship was fighting for survival. The men spoke quietly when they spoke at all. They knew the headlines might one day tell of their unbelievable victory, the ramming the fire, the hand-to-hand fighting the coffee mugs used as weapons, but they also knew that none of it would matter if the Atlantic swallowed them on the way home. As Able stood on the bridge, staring across the wide rolling horizon, he understood the truth more clearly than anyone. They had survived the strangest and most improbable naval battle of the war, but the real test had only just begun. Ahead of them lay 6 days of slow, vulnerable sailing across a dangerous ocean. 6 days in which whether mechanical failure or another lurking U-boat could end the Buckley and every man aboard her. The crew had fought like warriors in a 17-minute brawl on the deck. Now they had to fight with patience, vigilance, and faith. The battle was over, but the struggle for survival was just beginning. Winning the fight against U-66 did not mean Buckley was safe, because survival still depended on crossing 1,500 miles of ocean with only one working engine and a wounded hull that creaked under every shift of the waves. The first full day after the battle was the most critical. Buckley held steady at 13 knots, driven solely by the port engine as she steered a careful northeast course toward home. Damage control teams worked endlessly, checking weld seams, replacing wooden shoring beams, and pumping out the water that kept seeping through cracks in the starboard side. The Atlantic remained calm, as if granting the ship a fragile mercy, because swells no higher than 6 feet rolled under her keel. Everyone aboard knew that a real storm would tear the temporary patches apart and send the destroyer escort into a downward spiral. On May 7th, Block Island's air patrols reported no sign of any German submarine within 200 miles, yet even that did little to ease the tension. U-boats often stayed deep through daylight and surfaced only at night. The ocean was too wide and too deceptive to trust silence. By May 8th, Buckley had traveled 300 miles, yet still had more than 1,200 to go. The crew fell into a relentless routine. Lookouts scanned the horizon with strained eyes. Damage control teams made their inspection rounds. Fire parties remained ready. Gun crews stayed at their stations, though they prayed they would not have to fire a single shot. Meanwhile, word spread across the fleet. Radio intercepts confirmed that the German Navy already knew U-66 was gone, and that she had died in a fight the commanders refused to believe at first. Reports claimed American sailors had used coffee mugs in hand-to-hand combat when their ammunition ran dry. The story sounded absurd, but Buckley's action report specifically listed several General Mess coffee cups as ammunition expended. Even senior officers questioned it until they saw the official paperwork. The surviving Germans later confirmed under interrogation that they had indeed been struck by ceramic mugs during the melee. Some even retained injuries that matched the shape of a 3-inch cup rim. The 2 minutes of hand-to-hand combat quickly became the most unbelievable naval story of that year. Still, Buckley had to keep moving. The port engine began to show signs of strain. Oil pressure fluctuated. Heat rose slowly in the gauges. By May 10th, the ship was roughly halfway to New York, with 600 miles behind her and 600 miles ahead. The chief engineer recommended slowing to 11 knots to reduce stress, and Able agreed without question, because speed meant nothing if the engine destroyed itself. The ship adjusted course slightly to avoid rougher seas predicted to the north. Morale across the crew remained strange. The men had accomplished something extraordinary, yet they did not celebrate. Their ship was too damaged, their safety too uncertain. They had survived a 17-minute storm of steel fire and fists, but now faced days of quiet dread. The ocean was a silent hunter, and a crippled ship offered an irresistible target. On May 11th, a new threat arose when the starboard hull damage revealed a deeper problem. Saltwater corrosion was spreading faster than the weld teams could reinforce. The metal plates had been weakened severely by the collision. A heavy blow from a rising sea could rip the patches open. Weather reports gave a small relief. A stable high-pressure system covered the central Atlantic and promised calm weather for the next 72 hours. Yet no one trusted it completely. They all knew too well that forecasts in wartime were like promises written on water. By May 12th, that fragile calm shattered. A low-pressure system developed 400 miles to the northwest, and although it was not a full storm, it generated swells that rose 8 to 10 feet and towered over Buckley like moving walls. The patched hull groaned with every lift and drop. Inside the engine room, the port engine temperature climbed toward dangerous levels, forcing the chief engineer to reduce power until Buckley crawled at 8 knots. That meant 6 days to reach New York instead of 4. 6 more days exposed to danger. 6 more days hoping the sea did not tear the ship apart. That night the crew barely slept. Waves hammered the hull. Water seeped through new leaks along the starboard side. Pumps worked around the clock. Damage control teams rotated in shifts. The men felt every shudder in their bones. The engine room temperature rose again at dawn, forcing Able to make another choice. He ordered the ship slowed further to 6 knots to let the port engine cool while still maintaining enough movement to steer. The adjustment worked. Temperature dropped slightly, but this condemned the crew to an 8-day approach to land. Slow and vulnerable. Meanwhile, the story of U-66 spread through newspapers and radio broadcasts back home because public affairs officers saw the propaganda value immediately. American sailors defeating one of Germany's top submarines in hand-to-hand combat using coffee mugs sounded like fiction, but was entirely real. The Navy kept demanding details and photographs, but Buckley remained far out at sea, still limping forward, still in danger. Interrogations of the rescued German sailors provided more insight. Klaus Herbig, the first officer, had led about 12 men onto Buckley's foredeck with pistols and knives. He had hoped to buy his captain a few seconds to break free, but the Americans overwhelmed them with fire and fists and anything within reach. One German who reached below decks had survived 9 war patrols of U-66, yet was beaten back by a steward's mate wielding a coffee pot in a narrow passageway. He later admitted he had never imagined he would face such a weapon in the war. By May 10th, Buckley had covered more than 600 miles, yet danger remained everywhere. The port engine continued running hot. The hull groaned. Every man aboard watched the sea and prayed it would not turn violent again. They had won a battle, but had not yet escaped the war. The low-pressure system northwest of Buckley grew throughout May 12th, and by the afternoon it sent 8 and even 9-foot swells rolling toward the damaged destroyer Escort, and each wave felt like a hammer striking the patched starboard hull. Every rise and fall made the welded plates groan like wounded metal crying out beneath the strain. The sea had become a test of endurance. Down in the engine room, the port engine labored harder than ever, with oil pressure dropping and temperature climbing far into the danger range. The chief engineer had no choice but to reduce power again until Buckley crawled forward at only 8 knots. That meant New York was 6 days away instead of 4, and those 2 extra days weighed heavily on every mind aboard because they meant 2 more days in which a lurking U-boat or a sudden storm could end them. As night fell on May 12th, the swells reached 9 feet and water began to push through tiny weaknesses in the hull patches. It did not flood the ship, but the slow, insistent leaks never stopped, and damage control teams rotated in and out every hour, reinforcing beams, tightening bolts, hammering new wedges into place, and pumping away the water with relentless effort. None of the sailors slept more than a few minutes at a time. The ship felt alive beneath them, heaving, groaning, flexing like a creature fighting to survive. By dawn on May 13th, the port engine temperature had climbed again toward the red line, and if it overheated completely, the only engine they had left would fail. Able made a difficult decision. He ordered speed reduced to 6 knots. That was the slowest they could move while still keeping control of the ship. The adjustment allowed the port engine to cool slightly, and the temperature settled just enough to stay operational. Yet 6 knots meant that New York was now 8 days away. 8 days of fear. 8 days of hoping no German submarine would detect them limping across the Atlantic. 8 days of praying the sea would not rise higher. News of the strange battle with U-66 had already begun circulating beyond the fleet, because the story reached Navy public affairs officers who saw immense propaganda value. The idea that American sailors had defeated a legendary U-boat crew in hand-to-hand combat using coffee mugs as weapons felt like a tale from another age, and yet every detail had been confirmed in Buckley's official action report. Newspapers wanted the story, radio stations wanted it, photographers wanted images, but Buckley was still far from home and far from safe. The American public would have to wait. Meanwhile, the Block Island interrogators continued questioning the German survivors. Their accounts matched the Americans in every detail. They confirmed that the boarding attempt had been led by Klaus Herbig, with around 12 men armed mostly with pistols and knives. They described the chaos of gunfire at point-blank range. They described Americans swinging shell casings and fists, and they confirmed the presence of the coffee mugs. One German sailor had a circular bruise on his cheek the size of a 3-inch cup rim, and the medical officer recorded it as blunt force trauma from a ceramic object. These details only heightened the sense of disbelief among German command, who reported privately that they could not understand why Buckley had rammed at all. Ramming had not been seen as a practical tactic since the age of sail, yet Able had done exactly that when the range had closed to 20 yards and when other weapons could not be brought to bear. By May 14th, the weather improved slightly, and the swells dropped to 6 feet, giving the ship a small measure of relief. Buckley had traveled 900 miles from the battle site, and only 300 remained before reaching safety. The port engine stayed stable at reduced power. The hull patches held despite constant strain. The crew allowed themselves a quiet hope that the worst might be behind them. That hope lasted only a few hours. Late in the afternoon, the chief engineer reported another serious problem. The port engine oil pressure had dropped sharply again, and preliminary inspection revealed bearing damage that could not be ignored. The engine needed to be shut down for repairs, but shutting it down in the middle of the ocean meant drifting helplessly. They were still 280 miles from port, too far to drift and too far for an immediate tow. Able decided to reduce speed to 4 knots, the absolute minimum needed to maintain steerage. The bearing held at that speed, but the temperature rose and stayed high. 4 knots meant another 6 days at sea. The crew felt the weight of that number like a stone pressing on their chests. On May 15th, Block Island's air patrols detected a submarine contact 70 miles south of Buckley's position. It submerged before they could attack and disappeared into the depths, leaving behind only silence. Direction uncertain, intent unknown. If the contact headed north, it could find Buckley with ease because a U-boat on the surface could reach 18 knots while Buckley could barely make 4. Able ordered battle stations and the ship waited in breathless tension. Hours passed. The submarine surfaced again 60 miles south, moving west away from Buckley. It was likely heading toward its assigned patrol zone. The threat faded, but the reminder did not. They were easy prey, almost defenseless. The next morning brought a small gift. Weather reports predicted clear skies and calm seas for the next 72 hours. The engine bearing remained fragile but functional. The hull leaks grew only slightly worse. The crew dared to believe they might actually reach land. They had traveled 1,000 miles on one battered engine with a jagged hole in their side and still pushed forward. They were exhausted and strained, yet determined to finish the journey. But survival remained a matter of inches and hours, and any failure could still bring the ocean crashing into the heart of the wounded ship. The sea was calmer now, but no one aboard Buckley forgot how quickly luck could break. If the submarine contact detected on May 15th had turned north toward Buckley, the destroyer Escort would have had no chance because with one damaged engine pushing only 4 knots, she could neither flee nor dodge nor fight with any real strength, and every man aboard understood this truth with a hollow weight in his chest as the hours dragged on. They stood silently at battle stations, waiting for signs of an attack that could come from anywhere beneath the waves. But after 6 tense hours, Block Island's aviation patrols spotted the same submarine surfacing 60 miles to the south and heading west, which meant it was likely moving to a separate patrol zone and not hunting them. Relief washed across the ship like a soft wind through a weary forest, yet the reminder of how vulnerable they had become never faded. Buckley remained painfully slow with one failing engine and a hull stitched together by hope, skill, and desperation. The next morning on May 16th, the crew received rare good news. Weather forecasts predicted clear skies and calm seas for 3 days ahead, and the ocean around them shimmered with a steady, gentle rhythm that offered a fragile sense of safety. The port engine bearing was still degrading, but held together under careful supervision from the engineering team. The chief engineer estimated that at 4 knots they could survive another 4 days of travel and maybe even 5 if fortune stayed with them. New York was roughly 220 miles to the northeast, and simple mathematics showed that 4 knots over 4 days equaled 384 miles, which gave the wounded ship enough distance margin to reach assistance before the bearing failed completely. Around mid-day, Able received a message from the commander of the destroyer force Atlantic, who informed him that Buckley had become front-page news across the country. The New York Times published the story on May 14th, describing how the destroyer Escort sank a German U-boat in hand-to-hand combat, and every major news agency repeated the account. Radio broadcasts spoke of sailors fighting with coffee mugs on the deck of a warship. The Navy informed Able that when he reached port, he and his men would be expected to speak at public events, participate in interviews, and pose for photographs. But to Able none of that mattered. His eyes never left the horizon. Fame meant nothing if the ship did not make it home. He remained focused only on survival. On May 17th, Buckley had traveled another 80 miles and now sat roughly 140 miles from New York. The port engine ran hot but steady. The hull patches leaked more than before, but the pumps still handled the water. The crew was exhausted beyond words, yet they held to their duties with quiet determination. They had traveled more than 1,000 miles on a single damaged engine with a torn hull that should have failed days earlier, and the finish line seemed close enough to touch. Then disaster nearly struck. Just after midday, the chief engineer burst onto the bridge with a grim report. The engine bearing had reached a critical state. Metal fragments in the lubrication system indicated severe internal wear. He recommended shutting down the engine immediately. but they were still 135 miles from port. And if they stopped now, they would drift helplessly for days in waters known to be patrolled by German submarines. Able faced an impossible choice: drift and risk being found by an enemy, or push the last surviving engine beyond safe limits and hope it held long enough to reach tow range. After a moment of silence, he chose the latter. Run the engine to destruction if necessary. Just get close enough for a tug to reach them. The engineering team worked with grim focus. The engine temperature rose into the critical zone. The vibration deepened. The oil pressure fell, yet hour after hour the faithful machine kept turning. It was as if the ship itself refused to die. By midnight, Buckley had reached a point 90 miles from New York. Close enough. Able radioed a request for tug assistance, and 2 ocean-going tugs departed the harbor at 0200 hours on May 18th. Estimated arrival at 1,400 hours. At 0630 on May 18th, the inevitable happened. The port engine seized completely, metal screamed, the ship shuddered. Then silence filled the engine room, the bearing had failed, the engine was dead. Yet Buckley was only 70 miles from New York, and drifting safely within the reach of the oncoming tugs. For the first time in 12 days, the crew felt a weight lift from their shoulders. They no longer needed speed, they only needed time. The engineering crew secured the engine room. The damage was extensive and final. The men who had worked tirelessly to keep the crippled heart of the ship running now stepped away from their posts with a mix of relief and sorrow, because they had kept the engine alive far longer than anyone believed possible. At 14:15, the tugs arrived like guardian giants on the horizon. Thick tow lines were secured. Buckley came under tow at 3 knots, heading steadily toward home. As the hours passed, the skyline of New York slowly rose from the haze like a promise of salvation. Sailors lined the rails, watching the distant shape of land sharpen with every minute. They had survived the strangest naval battle of the war. They had killed or captured every man who boarded their ship. They had sunk one of Germany's deadliest submarines. They had sailed more than 1,000 miles on a single failing engine, and they had refused to die. At 2200 hours on May 18th, Buckley entered New York Harbor with the help of the tugs guiding her into the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Crowds gathered along the waterfront to witness the arrival of the ship, whose crew had fought with grit and ingenuity. Cameras flashed. Reporters waited eagerly, yet the crew did not think of fame. They thought only of solid ground, hot meals, warm beds, and the knowledge that they had made it home alive after a journey no one else would ever truly understand. When Buckley finally reached the Brooklyn Navy Yard, the exhausted crew prepared to step ashore, yet before a single man could descend the gangway, Able gathered them together on the deck and reminded them that their true achievement was not only the sinking of U-66, but the impossible voyage home across 12 days of danger with a torn hull and a dying engine. The hand-to-hand combat would become the headline, yet Able wanted the crew to remember the long fight afterward, the fight that demanded patience and skill instead of weapons. On May 19th, Buckley was towed north to the Boston Navy Yard for a full engineering assessment, because the preliminary inspection in Brooklyn made it clear that the repairs required were far beyond temporary patchwork. When the ship entered dry dock, the true scale of the destruction revealed itself in harsh detail. The bow had been bent 12 degrees to port by the force of the ramming. Internal frames in the forward compartments were crushed. The starboard propeller shaft was not simply broken, but the entire stern tube had cracked open, allowing seawater to rush in when the damage first occurred. Flooding had shorted electrical circuits all through the stern, and several bulkheads bore stress fractures that stretched across entire panels of steel. The port engine was a ruin with damaged bearings and a cracked crankshaft that would require a complete rebuild. Navy engineers estimated that repairs would take at least 6 weeks and possibly 8, because a new bow section had to be fabricated and a replacement shaft system built from scratch. While the ship rested in dry dock, the crew became national figures because the story of the coffee mugs had seized the imagination of the American public. Newspapers ran it day after day. Radio hosts retold it with awe. Newsreel cameras filmed the battered bow and the twisted metal that proved Buckley had rammed her opponent head-on. Crew members posed reluctantly for interviews as reporters pressed them to describe every moment of the hand-to-hand fighting, yet most sailors spoke humbly. They insisted they had simply used whatever was within reach: rifles when they had ammunition, knives when the fighting grew close, and when everything else ran out, they used mugs from the galley because survival demanded it. The public saw heroism. The sailors saw practicality. On August 31, 1944, a formal awards ceremony took place at the Boston Navy Yard. Captain George Meanell presided, and Lieutenant Commander Brent Able was the first to step forward. He received the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in command of Buckley during the early morning attack on U-66. The official citation detailed his decisions throughout the battle, including the high-speed moonlit approach, the rapid silencing of the submarine's guns, the evasive maneuvers against multiple torpedoes, the act of ramming, and the defense against the boarding party. The citation made no mention of coffee mugs, though that detail had already become legendary among sailors and civilians alike. Lieutenant Junior Grade Boris Kramer received the Bronze Star for his role in the engagement. Several other crew members were awarded commendations, and the entire ship received a Navy unit commendation for distinguished performance. Buckley also earned a Battle Star in the European African Theatre, ribbon marking her place in the official record of the war. Through June and July, the repairs continued. A new bow section was welded into place. The starboard shaft assembly was replaced with fresh machinery. The port engine was rebuilt piece by piece until it stood ready again for service. Electricians rewired damaged circuits. Hull plates were reinforced. By June 14th, Buckley was whole enough to return to duty, not pristine, but restored through the effort of countless workers who recognized the ship's role in one of the most unusual battles in naval history. Some of the coffee mugs that survived the fight were quietly saved by sailors who regarded them as personal relics of the strangest weapons they had ever held. Others were lost or broken in the chaos of the battle. Yet a few remained tucked away in sea bags as reminders of the night when modern war reverted to something ancient and brutal. Buckley soon returned to action after a period of refresher training at Casco Bay, Maine. She resumed escort duty across the Atlantic from July through November 1944, shepherding convoys to North Africa, while U-boats still prowled the waters in desperation. In April 1945, Buckley joined the destroyer escort Reuben James in the hunt for U-548, and together they sank the submarine in the North Atlantic using depth charges and coordinated attacks. There was no ramming this time, no boarding, no hand-to-hand combat. The battle followed the expected pattern of modern anti-submarine warfare. After Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, Buckley completed one final convoy mission to Algeria, then returned to the United States. Her war record now included 2 U-boats sunk, dozens of convoys escorted, and a single impossible fight that would be studied for generations. The hand-to-hand combat on her deck soon became required reading at the Naval Academy. Cadets studied the engagement as a case in tactical flexibility, and as proof that even the most advanced warfare could collapse into raw survival when technology failed. The lesson was not that coffee mugs made good weapons, but that a crew must adapt instantly to whatever situation arises and use whatever tools are at hand when the enemy closes the distance. Able had rammed because no other choice existed. His men had fought hand-to-hand because the enemy was too close for guns. They had survived because they refused to surrender an inch of their ship. As peace returned, Buckley's battered hull stood as a reminder that innovation sometimes appears in the least expected ways, and that courage often emerges in the span of a heartbeat when survival hangs on instinct alone. The crew of Buckley had fought hand-to-hand because the Germans had forced their way onto the deck, and the Americans had no choice but to meet them at arm's length using anything they could grab, and that brutal truth became the defining lesson of the entire engagement. When modern weapons failed, when distance vanished, when chaos took over, the only thing left was raw instinct. That was what the Naval Academy taught for decades afterward. That was why instructors held up the Buckley fight, as an example of how quickly a battle could transform into something ancient and primal. But after the war ended, Buckley herself had a quieter fate. She was decommissioned on July 3, 1946, and placed in reserve at St. Johns River in Florida. The Atlantic was peaceful again, and the massive wartime fleet no longer needed so many destroyer escorts. Ships that once fought day and night now sat along riverbanks in long silent rows, their paint fading in the sun. Buckley rested among them with her bow still marked by the bend left from ramming U-66, a 16-minute battle scar that remained visible for decades. Her war was over. On April 26, 1949, she was reclassified as Dare 5-1, a radar picket destroyer escort. The designation sounded important, but the change was administrative, and she never returned to active service in that role. She remained in reserve as the years passed quietly and slowly. On September 29, 1954, she was reclassified again back to her original D-51, though in truth nothing changed for the ship. She simply continued to wait as the world moved on around her. For 23 long years, Buckley remained in the reserve fleet. Visitors often walked along the rows of moored ships and pointed at the bent bow that looked as if the steel had folded like cloth. Veterans told the story again and again to younger sailors who stared in disbelief when they heard that American crewmen had once fought a German boarding party with fists and shell casings and coffee mugs. The legend grew even as the ship herself aged beyond usefulness. Finally, in 1969, the Navy struck Buckley from the official register. She was sold for scrap because the cost of repairing and modernizing her far outweighed any remaining purpose she could serve. The age of the destroyer escort had come to an end, replaced by more advanced technologies and larger, more capable ships. Soon after, she was towed to a breaker's yard. The scrapping process was swift and merciless. Steel plates that had survived torpedoes, collisions, and storms were cut apart by sparks and torches. Workers dismantled her piece by piece until nothing remained. Some sailors hoped to preserve her bow as a memorial, but the funding and interest fell short, and the attempt quietly died. By 1970, Buckley was gone completely except for the stories carried by those who had served aboard her. Yet the events of that May morning refused to fade. Naval historians kept the story alive. The fighting at such close range, the frantic brawl with coffee mugs, the ramming of one of Germany's most successful U-boats, it all became legend. In 1973, an unexpected letter arrived for Brent Able, who had long since left the Navy and built a life in California practicing law. The letter was from a former crewman of U-66, named Herman Hartmann, one of the 36 survivors Buckley had rescued from the sea nearly 30 years earlier. Hartmann wanted to thank Able for the humanity shown toward the Germans after the battle. Able was surprised but deeply moved. The letter also revealed something else. The surviving German crew had long wished to meet the Americans who had fought them and then saved them. They wanted to shake hands after a lifetime had passed. They wanted to face the men who had been enemies for minutes and brothers in survival for hours. Able agreed and helped arrange a reunion in Germany in 1978. When former Buckley sailors and former U-66 sailors met again, they were older with grey hair and slower steps, yet the memories remained sharp as glass. The Germans remembered the sound of boots thudding across Buckley's deck. The Americans remembered the desperate look in Klaus Herbig's eyes as he led the boarding attempt. Both sides remembered the confusion, the shouting, the heat of the fire rising from the conning tower, and the surreal moment when a simple coffee mug became a weapon. Some German sailors brought old photographs, images of U-66 before the war, pictures of the crew smiling beside their submarine, unaware of the fate awaiting them. Others brought photos showing battle damage from earlier encounters with aircraft. They had survived depth charges, strafing runs, and near-fatal hits, yet none of those trials prepared them for the final minutes of their 9th patrol. Able brought Buckley's action report detailing every decision. Every burst of fire, every inch of the ramming maneuver. The Germans read it carefully. They nodded in agreement at many parts and debated small details, but all accepted that the core of the story was true. The ramming, the boarding, the coffee mugs, the final sinking with the captain still aboard. The reunion ended with a sense of quiet brotherhood, not friendship born of peace, but respect forged in violence. They understood that war had made them enemies, but survival had made them kin. Able later said he was proud of sinking U-66 because it ended the threat to Allied shipping, yet he wished he could have saved more of the German crew, including their captain and the 24 sailors who died when the submarine slipped beneath the waves. Brent Able lived until 2007, reaching 91 years of age. In the end, his obituary spoke first of Buckley and U-66, because that strange, fierce, unforgettable battle had become the story that defined his life and the lives of everyone who stepped onto that deck on May 6, 1944. What people remembered most about Brent Able was not the thousands of miles he sailed or the convoys he protected or even the second U-boat Buckley helped sink in 1945, but the short, violent, impossible 16 minutes that unfolded on May 6, 1944, when the battle with U-66 turned modern naval warfare into something ancient and human. The survivors from both crews stayed in contact after the reunion in 1978. Letters crossed oceans. Occasional phone calls brought familiar voices back into each other's lives. They had formed a strange brotherhood, one born not of peace, but of a shared memory of a fight so close and so desperate that it stripped away every illusion about war. The irony stayed with all of them. Radar had detected U-66. Sonar had tracked her movements. Radio relays had guided aircraft to her position. Yet the battle had ended with fists, shell casings, and coffee mugs. No one forgot that. Klaus Herbig, the German first officer who had led the boarding attempt, attended several reunions over the years. He never apologized for what he had done. He explained calmly that his duty had been to create confusion, buy a little time, and give his captain one last chance to escape. The fact that it failed did not make the attempt wrong. Able respected that answer. He understood that both men had been forced to make immediate decisions in a moment when death pressed against them on every side. Able rammed because he had no other weapon left. Herbig boarded because he had no other hope left. Both men acted with complete conviction. The coffee mugs used in the fight became small artifacts of enormous meaning. Naval museums requested them. Private collectors offered money. Yet most of the sailors who had taken them home refused to give them up. Those mugs were personal. They were not trophies. They were reminders of a night when trained sailors transformed into something closer to warriors of another age. One mug eventually made its way to the Navy Museum in Washington, D.C. after its owner died. It sat in a glass case labeled simply Coffee Mug, used as a weapon USS Buckley versus U-66 May 6, 1944. Visitors often assumed the display was symbolic. They imagined it represented morale or humor. They did not realize it was literal, that mug had struck an enemy during a real fight on the deck of a real ship in the middle of an unforgiving ocean. As the years passed, analysts and historians studied the confrontation with growing fascination. They examined Able's decisions, the timing of the gunfire, the moments leading to the ramming, and the desperate close-range combat. They reviewed the submarine's records and the testimony of the German survivors. They ran simulations and tactical breakdowns, yet their questions circled back to one mystery. Why did U-66 attempt to board instead of diving or trying to break away? Standard doctrine said that after a ram, a submarine should separate, scuttle, dive, or flee. But the damage was too severe and too sudden. Herbig explained that their only chance was to shock the Americans, disrupt the bridge crew, and create a gap that would let the captain maneuver the submarine. The plan nearly worked. The counter-ramming that tore open Buckley's starboard side proved that U-66 had enough life left to kill her enemy. Had the collision struck 6 feet further aft, Buckley might have sunk. In that sense, the boarding was not madness. It was calculated desperation. Historians later taught that both commanders understood they were in a fight that had pushed past normal rules. Able rammed. Jowson tried to counter-ram and board. Both were using unconventional tactics because survival demanded it. The coffee mugs were simply the part everyone remembered. The deeper truth was that both sides fought with every scrap of ingenuity and instinct they possessed. The engagement influenced naval training for the remainder of the war. Destroyer escorts across the fleet increased small arms drills. Officers briefed crews on the possibility of close quarters attacks. Damage control teams practiced repelling boarders, even though such scenarios were considered almost impossible before Buckley proved otherwise. No one expected another hand-to-hand fight at sea, but the Navy decided it was better to prepare than be caught unaware. U-66's wreck was never found. She went down at 17 degrees 17 minutes north and 32 degrees 24 minutes west in waters more than 3,000 meters deep beyond salvage reach in 1944. Modern technology might be able to locate her, but no official search has ever been undertaken. For most, the wreck is not the story. The story is what happened above the waves during those 16 minutes when men from two nations collided in a storm of fire, steel, and instinct. The story is how technology failed and raw human will took its place. The story is how sailors fought with whatever they could reach in a moment when survival demanded more than training. If this story moved you the way it has moved countless people, then it speaks to something deeper than tactics or machinery. It speaks to courage found in impossible places. It speaks to men who refuse to break. It speaks to the power of memory that refuses to fade even after decades have passed. And it asks the listener to remember the sailors of Buckley and U-66, who fought each other and then rescued each other and then met again in peace long after the war ended because their shared story bound them together for the rest of their lives. Their courage, their suffering, and their strange, unforgettable battle deserve to be carried forward so they are never lost to silence. If you want more forgotten war stories told with truth, grit, and no filters, subscribe now. Your support keeps these missions alive.